James Parker had never been handed anything in life. Born into a modest family, he worked his way up from the very bottom of the corporate ladder, determined to carve his own path in the world of banking. He didn't have the privilege of connections or family wealth to help him along the way. His journey began at the age of 18 as a part-time teller at a small local bank while attending college. The long hours and constant interaction with customers, who ranged from kind and patient to rude and demanding, were exhausting. But James was committed. He worked hard to make ends meet, balancing his coursework and job, learning the ropes of the banking world. Over time, James moved up the ranks. He put in extra hours, attended every training session, and proved himself capable at every step. From teller to supervisor and then assistant branch manager, he earned the respect of his peers and bosses alike. When James eventually became the CEO of Ridgeway National Bank, he didn't forget where he came from. Unlike many CEOs who hid away in corner offices, he never let go of his connection with the daily workings of his bank. He didn't want to simply read reports or look at spreadsheets. He wanted to feel the pulse of his company firsthand. And so, every few months, James would go undercover. No suit, no title, no entourage. Just a man walking into his own branches as a regular customer. It wasn't a corporate exercise for show or a publicity stunt. It was to understand the real story behind the numbers. He would visit different branches, sometimes in larger cities, sometimes in smaller towns, to see how the employees were doing, how the customers felt, and whether there were problems that weren't captured in reports. For James, the job was more than just about profits and market share. It was about people, the customers, the employees, and the communities his bank served. Through his undercover visits, he could gauge employee morale, see how customers were treated, and spot any signs of deeper issues. If a branch was struggling, it wasn't always a lack of customers or bad business decisions. Sometimes the problem was in the environment, the leadership, or even the way employees were treated. Tonight, he had chosen a branch in a small town in Ohio, a place where he wasn't expecting any major issues to crop up. The branch's reports showed that profits were steady, customer satisfaction was high, and everything seemed to be running smoothly. On paper, it was another routine visit, but James knew from experience that numbers didn't always tell the whole story. As he walked into the branch, dressed in a simple navy blue button-down shirt with rolled-up sleeves and dark jeans, James blended in easily. It was the end of the workday, and the bank was quieter than usual, with just a few customers finishing their transactions. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the air conditioning was set too low, making the atmosphere feel sterile and uncomfortable. Behind the counters, tellers worked quickly, processing deposits and withdrawals with practiced ease. But something was off. James didn't expect to find anything major, just the usual complaints or minor inefficiencies that came with any busy branch. But as he waited in line to make a deposit, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. He watched a middle-aged man struggle with his debit card in front of the teller, a young woman named Emma who smiled politely, but her eyes betrayed her stress. The bank manager, a middle-aged man named Sinclair, stood near the back, watching with a kind of unnerving attentiveness. James tried not to think too much about it. There was always a bit of tension in a bank, sometimes from difficult customers, other times from an overbearing manager. But then, something caught his attention. A soft, muffled sound, like a stifled sob, came from the hallway leading to the break room. At first, James dismissed it, but when the man in front of him finished his transaction and walked away, the sound grew clearer. Someone was crying. James's instincts kicked in. He glanced over at the break room, where the door was slightly ajar. Inside, he saw a young woman sitting at a table, her head bowed, her hands gripping the edge of the table, as if she were trying to keep herself together. Another employee, a young man named Leo, stood beside her, speaking in hushed tones, trying to console her. The woman looked familiar. He recognized her as Emma, the teller. Something was wrong. James could feel it in his gut. James didn't approach Emma immediately, though every instinct in his body told him he should. Instead, he stayed in line, pretending to be just another customer making a routine deposit. His mind, however, was elsewhere, racing through the implications of what he had just seen. The quiet sobs, the way Emma seemed to be holding herself together at the table. It wasn't just frustration. This was deeper. The manager, Ron Sinclair, stood near the back of the bank, a silent sentinel, watching everyone and everything with unsettling intensity. He didn't seem to care about helping customers. No, he was focused on controlling the situation, on making sure the employees adhered to his expectations, almost as if they were there for his amusement rather than as part of a team working for a shared goal. James's gaze lingered on Sinclair for a moment longer. He didn't like the way the man was positioned in the room, always lurking in the background, eyes darting between his employees like a hawk watching its prey. James had seen this before. He had seen it in branches where toxic leadership festered, where the balance of power tipped dangerously. But he wasn't here to make assumptions. He needed facts. After a few moments, Emma wiped her face with the back of her hand, trying to regain her composure, though it was clear she was struggling. Leo spoke to her again, but James couldn't hear the conversation. He could see Leo's body language, though. Tense, his eyes constantly flicking toward the back of the branch, watching Sinclair like a dog afraid of being scolded. James knew what this looked like. It wasn't just a bad day or a tough customer, it was something darker. Finally, James decided it was time to make his move. He stepped up to the teller counter where another young man, Chris, was ready to assist him. Chris looked fresh out of college, his name tag reading Chris. His demeanor was professional, but James could see the stress written on his face. The man hesitated for a split second when he saw James approach, his eyes darting nervously toward the back of the bank before he forced a smile. "How's your day going?" James asked, trying to keep his voice light. Chris's hesitation lasted just long enough for James to notice, and then he forced out a response. "It's been good, sir. How can I help you today?" James pulled out a deposit slip from his pocket, a small, inconspicuous item he always carried with him during undercover visits. It wasn't a big deposit, just a formality for his visit. "Just need to make a quick deposit," he said. As Chris entered the account number into the system, James could see it. The man's fingers hovered over the keyboard, and his shoulders were tense. Chris was distracted, nervous even. The look on his face told James that something was eating away at him. He glanced over his shoulder once more, and James followed his gaze. Sinclair was watching them from his position by the back office. Before James could say anything further, Chris quickly finished the transaction. "Here you go, sir," he said, his voice a little too forced. "Anything else I can help you with?" "No, I'm good," James replied, taking the receipt. But he wasn't done here. Not yet. "Take care of yourself, Chris," he said quietly, his voice low enough so only Chris could hear. Chris stiffened at the words, his gaze flickering nervously toward the back again. He didn't respond, and James could tell the opportunity to get more information had slipped away. Chris was scared. He didn't want to get involved. James stepped away from the counter and made his way to the loan officer's desk, pretending to check his phone. From this vantage point, he had a clear view of the break room. Emma was back at her station, but her movements were stiff, almost robotic. She forced a smile at the next customer, but it didn't reach her eyes. She was just going through the motions, likely trying to survive the day without drawing attention. But the moment didn't last long. James saw Ron Sinclair approach Emma from across the room, his steps slow, deliberate. The manager's posture was calm but calculated. When Emma saw him, her whole body tensed. She quickly shoved her phone into her pocket and stood up, as though she had been caught doing something wrong. Sinclair spoke to her in a low voice, but James couldn't make out the words. Emma responded with the smallest of nods, almost imperceptible, before she walked past him, head down, and returned to her station. James knew something wasn't right. The entire interaction had been wrong. James's heart sank as he watched Emma return to her station. Her movements were stiff, almost robotic. There was a deep weariness to her, something beyond just the daily grind of banking. He had seen this before, in other workplaces where toxic environments were allowed to fester. It wasn't just about the stress of a busy day or a difficult customer. It was about control. The manager, Ron Sinclair, lingered near the break room door for a moment before slowly walking away, his eyes scanning the room, his gaze briefly flicking in James's direction. James held his ground, not letting his discomfort show on his face. He had a sinking feeling about what he had just witnessed, but he needed to gather more information before taking action. He could feel the tension in the air, thick with something unspoken. This wasn't just a case of a bad manager. It was something far more sinister. He had seen this dynamic before in his years of experience in the business world. A powerful figure who thrived on control, who manipulated others to keep them under his thumb. Sinclair wasn't just a micromanager, he was a predator. James stepped away from the counter and walked over to the side, keeping his eyes trained on the break room. He noticed Miles, the young man who had been speaking to Emma earlier, now standing by the counter, organizing a stack of deposit slips. His jaw was tight, his movements quick and precise. Miles looked like he was trying to stay busy, trying to avoid making eye contact with anyone. James saw an opening. He walked over casually, making sure his tone was neutral. "Excuse me, do you have a pen?" he asked, his voice light. Miles looked up startled. "Oh yeah, of course," he said, his voice a little shaky. He grabbed a pen from the cup on the counter and handed it to James. But as James took the pen, he didn't walk away immediately. He glanced at Miles's name tag. "Miles," he said, lowering his voice just enough so no one else could overhear. "I couldn't help but notice your friend seems upset." Miles's face tightened, but he didn't respond immediately. He seemed to be weighing his options, looking around the room nervously. Finally, he let out a quiet sigh and set down the stack of papers. "She's fine," he said, though his voice didn't carry the conviction of someone telling the truth. James tilted his head, his expression softening. "She doesn't look fine, Miles." Miles swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the back of the branch, where Sinclair was still keeping watch. It's personal," he muttered, voice barely above a whisper. James raised an eyebrow. "Personal?" he repeated, watching Miles closely. "Are you sure? Because from where I'm standing, this looks like more than just a bad day." Miles hesitated, then exhaled, his gaze dropping to the floor. She doesn't talk about it," he said, almost apologetically. "But it's not just the customers, okay? It's him, Sinclair." His voice dropped lower, and James had to lean in slightly to hear him. He makes her stay late, alone, every night. He's always talking to her like she owes him something. James felt a chill run down his spine. He had suspected it. There was more to this than just bad management. Sinclair wasn't just a controlling boss. He was taking advantage of his power, manipulating Emma to stay late, and using his position to intimidate her. "Has she ever said anything about it?" James asked, keeping his voice even, though his gut was twisting with anger. Miles shook his head. "Number. She doesn't have to," he replied, his eyes flicking toward Sinclair once more. "We all see it." James clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to confront Sinclair right then and there. The way Miles spoke, softly, nervously, it told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't just a toxic work environment, it was an abusive one. Before James could say anything else, Sinclair's voice cut through the tension. "Everything okay over here?" the manager asked smoothly, stepping up to them, his eyes narrowing as he glanced between James and Miles. His tone was polite, but there was an edge to it that James couldn't ignore. Miles immediately dropped his gaze, returning to his work, trying to act as though nothing was amiss. "Yes, sir," he said quickly, his voice shaking. "Just helping a customer." Sinclair's gaze lingered on James for a moment, his eyes calculating. James didn't break eye contact. He simply smiled politely. "Just getting a pen," he said, his voice casual. "Miles here was kind enough to help me out." Sinclair's smile was cold, his eyes narrowing just slightly. "Good," he said, clapping Miles on the shoulder a little too firmly. "Let's stay focused on work." Miles didn't respond, but his shoulders visibly tensed under Sinclair's touch. James could see it, a fear that went beyond mere discomfort. Sinclair had a hold on these employees, and he was using that power to manipulate them. James nodded at Miles, offering him a reassuring look, then stepped away from the counter. As he walked back toward the door, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just scratched the surface of something much bigger than he had anticipated. James knew that the time had come to act. Everything in him screamed that the situation at this branch was worse than he had first suspected. He couldn't let Sinclair's control over his employees go unchecked. The way Miles had spoken, so quietly, so afraid, was enough for James to understand the magnitude of the problem. Sinclair's behavior wasn't just authoritarian, it was manipulative and abusive, and it needed to stop. His mind raced as he considered his options. He could leave and report the situation through official channels, but he didn't want to risk Sinclair having time to cover his tracks. He needed to confront the man directly, to show him that someone was finally standing up to him. James glanced over his shoulder and saw Miles still working at the counter, his expression tense. He knew Miles was likely nervous about what might happen next, but James wasn't going to let him down. He wasn't going to let Emma down either. This was bigger than just a bad manager. This was about people, about making sure they didn't have to suffer in silence. Walking toward Sinclair, James moved with purpose. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him. He was about to confront someone who was used to getting his way, someone who thrived on the fear he instilled in others. But James wasn't afraid. He had faced challenges in his career before, and this one, though personal, was no different. Sinclair didn't seem to notice James's approach at first. He was deep in conversation with another employee, his back turned. But as soon as he felt James's presence, he turned, his face shifting into that practiced smile he used for the public. "Can I help you, sir?" Sinclair asked, his tone smooth, but there was a sharpness to his eyes that James didn't miss. "I'm fine," James replied, his voice steady. "I was just wondering if we could have a conversation." Sinclair raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "A conversation?" he repeated, his eyes scanning James briefly, as though trying to figure out if he was important enough to warrant his time. "Yeah, I think it's about time we had one," James said, his voice firm. "I've been observing things here, and I'm concerned about what I've seen." Sinclair's expression faltered for just a moment. He regained control quickly, but it was enough for James to see that something had shifted. "What exactly are you concerned about?" Sinclair asked, his voice a little colder now, his stance defensive. "I'm concerned about the way you treat your staff," James said, his words slow and deliberate. He was watching Sinclair closely, looking for any signs of discomfort, any cracks in the man's confident exterior. Sinclair scoffed lightly, clearly trying to brush it off. "I treat my staff with respect," he said, his voice smooth, but James could hear the tension there. "This is a professional environment. Everyone here knows what's expected of them." "Do they?" James asked, taking a step closer, his gaze unwavering. "Because I've seen something else. I've seen the way you make Emma stay late, how she's afraid to say anything about it. I've seen the way you control them with fear, and I've heard the whispers of your behavior." Sinclair's face tightened at the mention of Emma, and for the first time James saw the mask slip. The moment of vulnerability was brief, but it was enough. Sinclair didn't speak for a moment, his jaw clenching as he realized James knew more than he had expected. "You don't know what you're talking about," Sinclair snapped, trying to regain his composure. "This is none of your business. You're just some—" "No," James cut him off, his voice firm. "It is my business, and you're not getting away with it." James reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet. He flipped it open, revealing his executive ID from Ridgeway National Bank. Sinclair's eyes widened in shock, and for a moment he looked like he'd seen a ghost. "My name is James Parker," James said, his voice steady, commanding. "Chief Executive Officer of this bank, and you and I need to talk." The room fell silent. The few employees who were still around stopped what they were doing and turned to watch. They could sense the tension, the shift in power. Sinclair's face went pale and he stammered, "I didn't realize—" "No," James said, stepping closer, his voice colder now. "You didn't, but you should have." He could see Sinclair trying to backpedal, his mind racing to come up with excuses, but James wasn't listening anymore. He had heard enough. "I know about the late-night shifts, Sinclair. I know about the way you treat Emma and the way you've been manipulating her. You think you can intimidate people and get away with it, but not anymore." Sinclair's expression was one of disbelief, and for the first time, James could see the man's confidence crumble. "I'm calling corporate HR," James said, reaching into his pocket to pull out his phone. "You're done. You will never work in this industry again." Sinclair opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. His world, his control over this branch, was slipping away from him, and he could do nothing to stop it. James stepped outside after confronting Sinclair. His mind was still sharp with adrenaline, but he knew that things were far from over. The confrontation had been necessary, but this was only one part of a much bigger picture. He had done what needed to be done here, but the ripple effects of Sinclair's actions reached far beyond just him. As James made his way back inside, the tension in the air was palpable. The employees who had been working in fear for so long were now standing in quiet clusters. Their eyes followed him closely. It was clear this wasn't just another day. Sinclair was gone, and they weren't sure what would happen next. When James approached, they instinctively parted, creating space for him to stand in front of Emma, who had regained her composure. She was standing a little taller, her body language not quite as stiff as before. The fear that had been so evident just an hour ago had melted into something else: relief. "He's gone," James said, his voice low but firm. "He won't be hurting you anymore." Emma's face softened, and for the first time that evening, she looked at him fully, eyes wide with disbelief, and beneath that, hope. Slowly she nodded, and James saw her shoulders relax. The weight of a year of fear seemed to lift from her. The other employees were silent for a moment, letting the news sink in. James felt the eyes of everyone on him as he stood before them. They had all witnessed the power Sinclair held over them, and now, with one action, that power was gone. But James knew that this moment alone wasn't enough. He turned to address the group. "This branch has been operating under a toxic atmosphere, and that stops today," he said, his voice steady. "This won't just be about replacing Sinclair. We're going to change how things are done here. No more fear, no more intimidation. You all deserve better." Miles, who had been standing at the back, stepped forward. "Sir," he said, his voice strong for the first time, "this isn't just about Sinclair, though. It's the culture here, the pressure, the fear of speaking up. That's been here longer than he has." James's gaze sharpened. Miles was right. Sinclair wasn't the root cause. It was a larger issue, one that needed to be addressed throughout the bank, not just at this branch. "I'm aware of that," James responded, his tone resolute. "This branch is under direct review from now on. We'll make sure this place is a safe, fair workplace for everyone. If anyone feels something's wrong, you'll have the support you need." Kenny, who had been standing near the door, nodded in agreement. "We didn't feel like we could talk before," he said, his voice quiet but filled with conviction. "But now, maybe things can really change." James nodded back at him, his expression determined. "Yes, they will. No one should ever feel trapped like that again." He turned to Emma once more. "You're safe now," he said softly, reassuring her with a smile. She gave a small, hesitant nod, still processing what had happened. As James made his way toward the door, the employees exchanged glances. There was a sense of uncertainty, but also a spark of something else, the hope that their voices would finally be heard. When James stepped outside and saw the group of employees locking up for the night, there was a subtle shift in their posture. They weren't the same group of people who had walked in earlier that day. They were lighter, freer. James took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about one branch or one manager. It was about creating a culture where employees weren't afraid to speak up, where leadership took responsibility for its actions. He knew this was just the beginning. As he got into his car and drove away, he realized how much more needed to be done. But tonight, at least, one chapter had closed, and tomorrow a new one would begin.